In our final presentation in the series on the Hellenistic period, we will look at the Hasmonean dynasty, particularly its rise and its decline after the first generation of the family of Judas Maccabeus had consolidated power for the family. Greek and Roman historians give very little attention to events in Judea before Pompey's intervention in 63 BC. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the early years of the 2nd century AD, makes only this brief reference to the Hasmonean dynasty. Since the Hellenistic rulers were weak, the Jews established a dynasty of their own. These kings were expelled by the fickle mob, but regained control by force, setting up a reign of terror which embraced, among other typical acts of despotism, the banishment of fellow citizens, the destructions of cities, and the murder of brothers, wives, and parents. The kings encouraged the superstitious Jewish religion, for they assumed the office of high priest in order to buttress their regime. Tacitus's characterization of Hasmonean rule, while grossly one-sided, accurately reflects first the fact that it was the internal strife within the Seleucid kingdom that weakened this larger empire and allowed for the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty in the first place. Tacitus is also correct that this family, the Hasmonean family, did much to alienate their Judean subjects and arouse significant hostility, such as appears in some Jewish literature from the period. John Hyrcanus I and Alexander Jannaeus did, in fact, destroy cities in neighboring territories as part of their own program of expansion, notably the destruction of Samaria to the north. Judah Aristobulus I was guilty of murdering his mother and one of his brothers. And indeed, many fellow citizens would have preferred banishment to the fate that they suffered under some of these kings. For example, the 800 Judeans crucified by Alexander Jannaeus, while their families were butchered before their eyes. Tacitus's final comment, betraying his bitter anti-Jewish prejudice, actually inverts the Hasmoneans' policy. They assumed the office of king to buttress their regime, having begun with the office of high priest as an hereditary possession, beginning with Jonathan, the brother of Judas. For historical reconstruction of this period, we rely primarily on Josephus's Antiquities, and on occasional, if somewhat cloudy, references in the Qumran biblical interpretation scrolls, the Pesharim, and the Damascus Covenant, and then for the later part of this period, a collection of prayers known as the Psalms of Solomon, probably composed by a pious Jew at some in various stages between the years 63 and 48 BC. John Hyrcanus I was the son of Simon, the son of Mattathias. This Simon was the last surviving brother of Judas Maccabeus, even though Simon was elder, I believe, to Judas. John Hyrcanus I ruled over Judea from 135 to 104 BC. He defended against some attempts by Antiochus VII by this point to reassert Seleucid control over the region. Antiochus VII even besieged Jerusalem, to the point that Hyrcanus had to agree to pay a heavy tribute and promised to send soldiers to support Antiochus VII's campaigns. Internal struggles over the Seleucid throne again emerged after Antiochus VII's death, with the result that Hyrcanus was able to renege on the terms of the bargain and to begin expanding the territory of his realm in turn. As part of his aggressive expansionist program, he captured Shechem in 128 BC, and he destroyed both Samaria and Shechem about 20 years later. He was able to annex territory to his own as far north as Scythopolis. He invaded Idumea to the south as far as Beersheba, forcing its inhabitants to accept circumcision and adopt Judaism as their way of life. He also captured several of the cities in the region beyond the Jordan, the Transjordan to the east of that river. Hyrcanus had a falling out with the Pharisees, which had been an influential party in the early years of the Hasmonean dynasty, after one of the Pharisees questioned his genealogical fitness to remain in the office of high priesthood, though not his fitness to hold on to the secular power. The remainder of the Pharisees, rather than suggesting the death penalty for this one upstart, actually argued against a stiff penalty in favor of a lenient punishment than the death sentence Hyrcanus wished to impose, with the result that Hyrcanus found himself alienated from the whole party, and the Sadducees gained an influence, therefore, toward the end of his rule. Hyrcanus had intended for his wife to succeed him to the civil authority. Of course, his wife could not succeed to the high priesthood. That would fall to one of Hyrcanus' sons. But his eldest son, Judah Aristobulus I, intended to retain both the high priesthood and civil rule. He therefore killed his mother and imprisoned 3 of his brothers, one of whom, the one named Antigonus, was also eventually executed. Aristobulus was the first member of the Hasmonean dynasty to use the title king. Now the Hasmoneans had usurped not only the high priesthood, traditionally belonging to the Zadokite line, but also the kingship, belonging to David's line. Usurped, that is, from the point of view of more conservative and traditionalist Judeans. During his very short reign, he only reigned from 104 to 103 BC, Aristobulus I was nevertheless able to expand into Upper Galilee and annex the region known as Iturea, also requiring its inhabitants to circumcise themselves and convert to Judaism. He and his father, John Hyrcanus I, thus pursued as policy forced conversion, what Antiochus IV had accepted only as an extreme measure to stamp out resistance. It is possible that one of the documents found among the Dead Sea Scrolls speaks in retrospect against John Hyrcanus I, referring to the deaths of 2 of his sons, Antigonus and then, of course, King Judah Aristobulus I, as a fulfillment of the divine curse pronounced against the person who would rebuild the city of Jericho, as Hyrcanus in fact did, establishing also a great palace there for the Hasmonean household. The widow of Aristobulus, Salome Alexandra, released Aristobulus's 2 remaining brothers and married one of them, Alexander Jannaeus, making him thus king and high priest. Alexander was able to rule from 103 to 76 BC. Jannaeus continued to expand the borders of the Hasmonean state, gaining control over all of the coastal cities from Gaza to the south to Dora, as well as gaining territory in the region of the Decapolis. He aroused much internal opposition, and he crushed the same with excessive brutality. His rule was so intolerable for some Judeans that in 88 BC they appealed to one of the rivals for the Seleucid throne, Demetrius III, for intervention. Demetrius did, in fact, come to Palestine with his armies and defeated Jannaeus in battle at Shechem, but after Demetrius withdrew, Jannaeus took bitter revenge against his opponents, crucifying 800 Jews and slaughtering their families while they looked on helplessly. Following Jannaeus' death, and possibly on his advice, Salome Alexandra, who ruled as queen from 76 to 87 BC, reconciled the dynasty to the Pharisees at last. Just a brief recap to give a sense of the expansion of the Hasmonean state, beginning with Judas Maccabeus, who basically inherited the small territory of Judea, never officially, but managed to gain effective control of this region from Seleucid hands. And the way various of his brothers, first Jonathan and then Simon, and then Simon's descendants, starting with John Hyrcanus, and then Aristobulus, and even more so Alexander Jannaeus, really restored the dimensions of the state of Israel to its former greatness under King David. So one could see that the Hasmonean dynasty was, although from an internal point of view, in many ways a real disappointment to the Jewish population, in terms of geographical and political accomplishment, the first time the Davidic monarchy, the Davidic kingdom, had been gathered together under a Jewish monarch again since the divided kingdom shortly after Solomon's death. Salome managed to maintain the boundaries of territory as her husband, her deceased husband, had expanded them. During her reign, John Hyrcanus II, her elder son, also the elder son of Alexander Jannaeus, functioned as high priest. This was John Hyrcanus II. John Hyrcanus was in line also to become king when Queen Salome died, but John Hyrcanus's younger brother, Judah Aristobulus, who would come to be Judah Aristobulus II, had other plans. Supported by his personal allies, Aristobulus seized the fortresses and strongholds throughout Judea and used the money stored in them to raise an army of mercenary soldiers, proclaiming himself the king and high priest. Hyrcanus II lacked the necessary support to prevail, and so he came to terms with Aristobulus. An Idumean named Antipater, however, whose son Herod would become a major player in Judea, persuaded Hyrcanus to break his truce, to flee to King Aretas in Petra, and seek support for seizing back his birthright. King Aretas provided 50,000 soldiers, allowing Hyrcanus to drive Aristobulus and his army back into Jerusalem where they were besieged. At this point, Rome intervened in the affairs of her eastern allies. Back in the early Hasmonean period, when the war for independence was still going on, Jonathan had sent envoys to Rome on behalf of the Judean state, seeking Roman support against the ongoing Seleucid occupation of the land. So Rome had some precedent now for continuing to look after and intervene in the affairs of Judea. Pompey, known as Pompey the Great, because he was one of the triumvirs who, together with Marcus Licinius Crassus and Julius Caesar, jointly ruled the Roman Republic for a rather rough period, since the three of them did not get along and degenerated into civil wars once again. Nevertheless, Pompey, who was entrusted with affairs in the east, sent one of his generals to lift the siege in Jerusalem and investigate matters. The two brothers came to Syria, where Pompey was stationed, to present their cases to him. A third party also showed up, quite interestingly, an embassy of leading Judeans, more than 200 in number, complaining about the tyranny and the brutality of Hasmonean rule. Pompey heard all embassies and instructed each brother to maintain the peace until he could come himself to Judea to settle their affairs. Aristobulus, however, mobilized for war instead. Pompey thus marched his army against Jerusalem and Aristobulus. And even though Aristobulus abandoned hope of resistance and left the city to meet Pompey and surrender, Aristobulus's supporters would not open Jerusalem's gates. Pompey prepared to lay siege to the city, but Hyrcanus's supporters got control of the gates themselves and opened them for Pompey to enter with his soldiers. The supporters of Aristobulus took refuge in the temple area. After a siege lasting 3 months, Pompey broke through and gained access to the temple. He killed the partisans that he found inside, including some priests who were carrying out the religious service and sacrifices. Pompey and his officers even went into the holy places, perhaps simply to ensure that no insurgents were hiding there, perhaps simply to see its treasures. The historian Josephus affirms, however, that Pompey did not confiscate any of the furnishings or wealth deposited in the temple, and even ordered the priests to perform the necessary purification rites and resume their services the next day. The story ends for the Hasmonean dynasty with Pompey making John Hyrcanus II high priest, but not king, committing political authority to a Judean senate instead. Judea became a Roman province and was required to pay an annual tribute. The territories that had been annexed by John Hyrcanus I and his sons were made independent of Judea once again, though likewise answerable to Rome. Judea fell once again under the yoke of the Gentiles after a mere 80 years of independence. The power with which Judea would now have to reckon for almost the next 2 centuries was the power of Rome. Still a republic in terms of its internal constitution, Rome nevertheless had a growing empire. In an earlier presentation, we had seen the state of the Roman Empire around about 200 BC, largely limited to Italy and these larger Mediterranean islands, to the coast of Spain and the western coast of Macedonia. By 50 BC, it had spread its influence throughout Gaul, famously with Julius Caesar's invasion and conquest of Gaul, across North Africa, beginning with the destruction of Carthage and the Roman victory in the Punic Wars, the wars against the North African Empire of Carthage, and even throughout Asia Minor, Syria, and finally Palestine. The ultimate beneficiary of the Hasmoneans' demise was this gentleman, who had come to be known as Herod I, or Herod the Great, a fully Hellenized, a fully Romanized, half Judean, half Idumean. The enduring legacy of the Maccabeans was a renewed zeal for the restoration and secure establishment of the kingdom of Israel. Even if Jews ceased to view the Hasmonean kings as worthy or faithful leaders, they would now continue to hope for a future king who would take the best achievements of the Hasmoneans and combine them with a perfect embodiment of traditional Jewish virtues and hopes. Thus, Messianism and the fostering of hopes for God's perfect restoration of Israel flourished during the period following the Hasmoneans' demise in such a way as would dog the reigns of Herod the Great and one of his successors, Herod Antipas, who would preside over part of the trial of another messianic figure of a very different sort than encountered in the Hasmonean family.